Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Zombie Train. This is episode number 265. I'm your host, Ellis, otherwise known as Train Man. And this week we have a question from Midwestern 261 Productions, back on episode 218. And the full wording is as follows. Did you ever encounter WMSR 734 when you ran near the Western Maryland Scenic Railroad? Did you ever run into the Illinois Railway Museum for engines such as Frisco 1630, Milwaukee Road 265, ATSF 2903, or SSL 803? Now, I had to look in the records a little bit, because I did not know what SSL 803 was off the top of my head until I realized SSL means South Shoreline. That's one of the, it's a Little Joe. It's an electric engine. So that's why I was like, wait, what? But yes, actually. Yes, and yes. So 734 is something else. Because it was kind of a mechanical mess. It wasn't too bad, because it was still running. So there wasn't, that much that had to be done to get it running, but it was a little rough. It was kind of like, we expect this to break any day now, and it hasn't yet, but we're not, we hedged our bets a little bit, and this is actually where 1630 comes in. So 734 stayed largely where it is, up in the mountains, and its purpose became hauling coal trains. So, it did its job. Obviously, they weren't particularly large coal trains, because it's a consolidation. It's a big one, but it's still a consolidation. And, we thought, okay, so this is going to break any day now. We need to put an engine up there that can back it up, basically. And when we got 1630 out of the IRM, we decided that this engine is, it's runnable, pretty much, and it needs to, it was not runnable yet, but it was very well on the way to being runnable. So, we finished its rebuild and then immediately sent it out to, basically, the WMSR, because we were using their area. I think I've talked about them very briefly before. We were kind of using their stuff. It wasn't the safest thing in the world, but we were using it because it had relatively easy access to where we were pulling coal out of the ground. I'm going to pull up the map for a second. But hold on one second. And yeah, again, we were using their stuff. It was not particularly safe. Thankfully, the depot is not where everything is. Their shops are across a river and are fairly defensible. But that was basically the only thing we were defending. We really weren't, we really didn't care about the rest of the town at all. We had a contingent that guarded the shops and that did, that basically did work for us. And we would send an engine there periodically to get worked on. Now, this wasn't, it sort of came about. It's not like we stumbled upon this amazing back shop with all sorts of things, etc., because that's not at all what happened. In fact, the facilities are pretty limited there. So we weren't able to, do much initially, but because we had space and because it was, fairly defensible, like I said, we started to move things to that location, and we even put up a couple of kind of crappy, but buildings, and I believe we stuck a turntable in somewhere. I haven't been back there in a while. It doesn't really get the traffic that it used to because we've transitioned away from using steam engines, primarily. But, yeah, so 734 immediately had a running mate, which was 1630, which was a long, long haul for 1630. And we kind of jumped the gun on that because we sent it out and then we didn't really have anything that was really workable at the IRM. And then we figured, okay, well, if we get electric power back, because we had local, like, on-site power thanks to some generators, which generators, for the record, were something that we would try to avoid, but it was, we want to get 1630 out, and everything that we need is right here. So, yeah, we sent it with a whole bunch of coal cars, because we were looking for good coal cars, and they happen to have some. So we sent it with coal cars to, not West Virginia, but Western Maryland. And, yeah, that was that. And then we realized, oh, we really don't have anything left. What can we do about this electric stuff? And so we did some other work, which I can get into, in the future. But let me, again, reacquaint myself with the area, because I've talked about this before. Yeah, the IRM is a big, empty, flat area, kind of dangerous. We were figuring we could get stuff out of there quickly. Didn't really happen. And there were a few times, I believe, that we had to evacuate the whole thing and then come back to it later. And I might have talked about that when I talked about the IRM, because I got questions asked about using electric engines, which is why the IRM was special, is because it had that infrastructure that we could just supply power to. The only problem was the following. We did not have a way to tap into the grid to get power directly to the museum and not waste a whole bunch on other things, aside from the actual IRM, the South Shoreline catenaries. Or, yeah. And so we were effectively we were going back and forth on this, just like thinking, okay, is it worth it? Or that's not, or South Shoreline-esque, I guess, is it, because it's not, whatever, the electrified trackage, you know what I mean. I'm not too familiar with that area, but you know what I mean. The electrified trackage that runs out of the museum, it's not SSL, it doesn't go anywhere, but it is electrified trackage, and we sort of figured, hey, if we can tap into this, then we should be able to send power to the museum over these poles and nothing else. And then we won't have any problems with the pole, with other things taking power when we don't want them to. Now, they really weren't outfitted for that, but we made it work. We couldn't really use too much in the museum at once, and there were a couple of instances where we did, and burned out fuses or just sort of melted wires, and it was generally bad news. But we ended up having the museum supplied by power via the cables themselves that were being used for the overhead. And then whenever we wanted to run an engine, we had to sort of switch everything around and run things at a different, I think it was a different voltage or a different frequency or something like that. Just the way we had everything set up, which sounds insane because it is. But to do that, we had to extend wires off the end of the track to a place where we could get focus on a power plant. We did that by cannibalizing other nearby wires. But once we did that, we realized, well, why don't we just extend the electrified trackage? And we did that, and that's how 803 became useful, effectively. And so we then were using 803 not only for shunting things around at the museum itself, which it had issues doing because the museum trackage is a little bit tight. There are other engines there that did things better, but 803 was, a good puller. It was a big, heavy engine. And so to get the other engines out of the way while I still have time, there are the two Northerns in there, which we ended up getting out of there, and then repairing. Ended up repairing, and then they started doing long distance runs with 449 and 261 and the other engines that are in Portland, and basically any other big Northerns we could get our hands on, because Marias Pass was a favorite of ours because it's relatively low grade, and also the fact that it's relatively secluded for almost its entire length means that no matter what, you're probably not going to have too much trouble with zombies. And so we used Marias Pass very heavily. And also, that was it, because the other one is 803. 803 never really left the museum as a home. 803 definitely, 803 left the museum a lot, but it never left the electrified trackage that we had added, which, I talked about this when I got asked about electric engines, but it sort of extended. We ended up electrifying the line pretty far. We started stringing up electrification on the main line. We got all the way to, Chicago, which is pretty far. And out the other way, where did we go? I think it might have been to Rockford, or just one of these major cities around here where we could make a transfer. But, if anything needed to go just in that area, that's what that's what we used. We used the electric engines if at all possible, because it made things easier, though we did have those power problems I mentioned. So I can elaborate more on that a little bit. I want to say there's a plant nearby, but we may have just tapped into high voltage lines. This was a crackpot scheme that wasn't my idea. It was like, we could, what we tried to do is we tried to electrify the whole area, but there were too many things. There was too much of a bleed, and we couldn't really figure out where it was all coming from. We sort of just figured that, okay, there are just too many things on in these houses that were left on during the Great Panic that we can't put enough power into the system to make a meaningful difference. To actually get anything out, really. And so, we started using that as a sort of isolated circuit, and we definitely did snip some high voltage lines, because that was a problem later where we were trying to re-energize a whole area for people, and they weren't getting any power, and we had to sort of go back and figure out why, and that was why. But it was a very concentrated effort. It was this whole town is dark, but the high voltage lines that run through it are now fully electrified. But then you get to the changeover point where the lines intersected the track, and there was a set of transformers there that we had brought in from a substation and wired up. And there was you could effectively just call the big switch. And it was, you're either running it to supply power to the buildings and everything, or you're running it to supply power to the locomotives, and whatever the buildings pick up is kind of secondary. And that, it was in that mode a lot, which it shouldn't have been. It should have been in the other mode a lot, and then whenever they really needed to use one of the electric engines, they would, switch the mode, but they had to go all the way down to basically the end of track, effectively the end of track, in order to switch the mode, and they couldn't just leave somebody there because it was in the middle of nowhere. And we tried to work out, and this was where I come in. I was like, can you work out some sort of radio-controlled thing? But it wasn't reliable. We did build something, but it wasn't reliable. At least that's what I hear. So, anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video of electrical mayhem and mishaps, and me confusing where the South Shore is. And I will see you next week. Feel free to ask questions down below, and I'm ending this ahead of time. Trainman out.